Hello YouTube, it's John here again. Today is June 23rd, 2025. Seem to have lost track of a day. At 11:30 p.m. my time, Central Standard Time, and about 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, a bit of a market after action report here. I got to this a little late. Ran into a couple issues. I got a new microphone here for y'all, a Blue Yeti. So I hope the sound quality is better. Let me know if it is. I did disable the other microphone I had been using, and that took about an hour or two. Jerry rigged that together. It was sounding very echoey. Apparently, if you have two microphones active, one impacts the other. But enough about that. Jumping into things. A bit underwhelming today. So crude oil saw a 7% decrease later in the day. Imagine my shocked face there. This whole market is just rigged here. It's just completely disgusting. So let's get the disclaimer out of the way. All these views are my own and do not reflect the views of the Department of Defense, and these views are apolitical. I'm analyzing these from a geopolitical standpoint and how that affects the financial markets. But jumping into it, Iran struck the U.S. back. And it's like I said yesterday, they gave the middle of the road strategy. They could either retaliate in full force or do nothing. If they retaliate in full force, that invites more U.S. attacks. If they do nothing, they roll over and lose face. And they took a middle of the road approach, like I said, where today they gave the U.S. warning there to attack the base in Qatar. They launched the missiles. No U.S. service members died, and then that allowed them to save face somewhat, while also not escalating the situation. Crude oil nosedive because of that, down 7%, which is just mind-boggling because it's down 7% from where it was on Friday. Now, to put that in perspective, if you study expected value theory, if there's even a 1% chance that this goes hot and Iran mines the Strait of Hormuz, which I don't think is going to happen, but there exists a possibility of that occurring, the price of crude oil would have to be greater than where it is right now. Maybe by not a lot, maybe by 1% or 2%, but not down from where it was, unless everyone knew about this. If you were a believer in the efficient market hypothesis, unless everyone knew the U.S. was going to attack Iran, which we were able to predict it on this channel here, but that was just a prediction. We didn't know that was going to happen. Then that makes sense that crude oil was down, but in reality, it's just Wall Street playing its games again, shuffling paper derivatives of commodities around to suppress the true price and manipulate the price, and it's just disgusting. But that's what we're seeing there. I'm sure in the long term, crude oil will settle out and go higher. Just ignore the noise. We're bombers flying through the flak right now. Okay, we got to get from point A to point B. There's going to be turbulence and flak bursting around us. We're going to be the bomber flying through the flak here and tune out any distractions. Let them play their games. As Gregory Mannarino says, we'll play our games. But we see Middle East, this is on CNBC, Middle East freight rates are soaring because of that potential Strait of Hormuz closure. They seem to be on the same page as us, but I guess the people on Wall Street aren't. Now, recently, this was after the markets closed, President Trump said that they had reached a ceasefire, and then a little after that, the missiles are still flying, so doesn't look like a ceasefire to me. We'll see how that plays out, though. There exists no incentive for Israel or Iran to agree to a ceasefire here. In reality, there may be a technical end to fighting for a day or two while each side rests and recuperates and rearms. But in the long term, and by long term I mean the next few weeks, the fighting will pick up again. It's not going to end until either Israel or Iran has defeated the other. It'll just, the war will continue from there. But Bitcoin is up today. Gold, silver, platinum, palladium are all up. The market in general is up as well. So it seems to be a bit of a who knows what's going on. But jumping from that, I have 3 pages of notes here, which I'll be covering on another video later this week. I want to make this video more professional and a higher grade because this will be covering collateralized loan obligations on Wall Street. We touched on that a little yesterday, but just to touch on this again, some new stuff I found. Private equity is basically creating new investment funds to repay older funds that can't pay out their investors because all the underlying loans are crap and not worth a dime. And in addition to that, a couple of rating agencies whose judgment I'm going to be calling into question here, like a rating agency, Egan-Jones, a private credit rating agency that somehow in 2024 rated 3,000 private credit deals in 1 year with a staff of 20 people. Does that sound suspicious to you, or does it? That sounds like a load of bull crap right there. But one person rating one of these deals alone would take a month. 20 would be able to rate, if they were doing their jobs effectively and honestly, they could rate 480 a year. They're rating 6 times that amount. They are lying on these ratings. They're not looking at what's in these things, and they're shoveling it along to collect their fee. They don't care. They just care about the money they make on it. They don't care who they shovel that slop to, just as long as someone eats it. But going on from there, another game they're playing there is these secondary private equity investment funds are acquiring these collateralized loan obligations at discounts because no one's buying this crap before. Yale's endowment just sold $6 billion of these recently. And they're shoveling. The next move will be them shoveling it off to the retail investor, you and me, and they're going to expect us to buy that. And private equity, one fund just acquired a bunch of them at a severe discount, and then they marked the price of these CLOs back up to where they were because they said, well, the underlying bonds are still fine. If they were still fine, why did you acquire it at a discount? Okay, if there was a fire sale on these things going on, they're on sale for a reason. If it was such a good deal, people would be selling them at the full price. But going on, well, they expect people to believe their crap for now, and it will happen for a while. But eventually, the walls will come crumbling down. And then going on from that, to summarize the conclusions of what I found is in 2008, we are dealing with credit default, or not credit default swaps, rather collateralized debt obligations, of which credit default swaps were the method to short those. And the banks got themselves in hot water because there were 1.3 trillion of these subprime adjustable rate mortgages in these collateralized debt obligations, and about 20 trillion conservatively in derivatives bets based on those. There's 3.8 trillion in collateralized loan obligations that are filled to the brim with subprime adjustable rate corporate loans. And who knows how many derivatives are based on that. So to sum it up, the banks are making the same bets they were in 2008. They're ignoring the Dodd-Frank Act because and they do that by using middlemen like private equity and private credit to indirectly make these same bets, collect their fees, shovel it off to pension funds, retail investors, and make a profit. That's what's happening there. But I'll do a more in-depth video on that. But coming down from there, Federal Reserve Governor Bowman favors July rate cut if inflation stays low. That's according to CNBC. And then Federal Reserve Chair Powell is set to testify before Congress for why he's holding rates where they're at now. Now, if you're not following news with that, all the other major central banks are cutting rates to stimulate their economies. They see a recession coming. And I guess they're trying to jump the gun there We'll see if that works. But the Federal Reserve is maintaining that inflation is still too high for them to cut rates where they're at now. And it's a crisis of their own creation. All right, in the COVID-19 pandemic, they came out with the lies saying that, well, if we see inflation, then it'll be transitory. As if you won't see inflation after printing tens of trillions of dollars, or after tens of trillions of dollars of quantitative easing. They thought we were so stupid they prefaced it with an if. Okay? It was just a simple formula of money velocity. Once the pandemic started to loosen up and those assets started to circulate, eventually they would trickle down to goods and services. And even my economics professors in college believed that. They said, even when the inflation came, they said, well, this is going to be transitory. And I asked one of them after class, one of my macroeconomics professors, and I said, do you honestly believe this? And in my head, I wanted to say, how delusional are you? I mean, this isn't complex calculus here that we're dealing with. This isn't theoretical physics. It's if you print $10 trillion, it's not a matter of if, but when that trickles down to goods and services. And then we have stuff like the CPI coming out saying inflation's at X percentage. In reality, it's a lot higher. They're lying on the CPI, okay? They've been lying for a long time. If you don't know how the CPI is calculated out, in a very simplistic manner, they'll take a basket of goods and say the cost of beef went up 3 times in a year, or 3x in a year. And we'll keep it in nice round numbers to simplify this. Let's say beef 3x in a year and chicken doubled. The Federal Reserve would come in and say, well, anyone who's eating beef before could eat chicken as a substitute. Therefore, the price of meat overall just doubled, completely discounting the price of beef tripling and saying, and from there just fudging the numbers lower, as if the price of beef would ever decrease right after inflation hit. That doesn't happen in today's world. And then I'm sure later on they would just do the opposite. So say beef had a run up and then beef doubled and then chicken tripled. Then they would say, well, we're going to use beef now in this CPI calculation and meat only doubled. So in reality, the price of meat has gone up by a factor of 9 and they counted up by a factor of 4. And that's what we're dealing with here, just blatant lies and manipulation. And their end goal is just to kill the middle class, to milk them dry and sacrifice them on the altar for the 1%. The middle class are going to be the only ones to suffer here. In fact, if you don't believe me, just look at the purchasing power of a dollar 100 years ago and compare it to today. It's lost 99% of your value. Do you honestly think that trend will continue, or it will continue? Do you honestly think that trend will stop or get better? No, it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get worse from here on out. Probably lose 99% of its value in 50 years if we're going at this rate, and then 25 years to the point we've reached hyperinflation. Got another video on that feedback loop, and I want to jump into that. But the 1% are the only people who benefit from inflation because all of their wealth is in assets. So if inflation goes up 10%, their assets go up 10% or even more. And if you think it ends there, there's a saying within the upper echelons of society of buy, borrow, die. So if Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates wants to take out, or Elon Musk wants to take out $50 million to buy a yacht, they'll take out a $50 million loan. None of that counts as income because it's debt. And say that loan was at 3% and inflation was at 4%, they're even making money off the loan. So so on one hand, their assets are completely resistant to inflation, and sometimes it even increases more than inflation. So they're making money on that side. And then on the other side, they get these loans that are less than inflation, interest payment wise. So they're making money there as well. If you pay less on a loan than inflation, the bank is losing and you're making money. And then when they die, the bank comes in, takes their collateral, they make a profit, and it goes on from there and repeats. Now the bank makes money too. You may be asking, why would a bank give a loan that's less than inflation? It's because the bank is playing with make-believe dollars. The middle class goes and deposits some money at the bank, and say the Bank of Texas, you had 1,000 middle class workers who went in and deposited their money in there. The bank would multiply that by 10 and then loan dollars they created, imaginary dollars, to make a profit, and then rake in the cash from there. So the bank makes money off of imaginary dollars. Inflation doesn't affect them. Inflation doesn't affect the upper echelons of society. In fact, it benefits them. And then the middle class is stuck with a salary that, say, inflation is 10% a year, and their salary raise is 5%. They're losing 5% purchasing power every year. Those who don't pay attention to it are getting robbed blind. I mean, people should be out in the streets protesting this stuff. It's just endless deficit spending, and the middle class will be killed into until they don't exist anymore. They're going to be murdered. And at the end of it, you're going to have techno-feudalism, where you're going to have the 1% at the top is going to own everything in assets. They're going to be at the top of the pyramid, and you're going to have the 99% at the bottom who owns nothing, and they're going to be peasants living in the muck. They're going to own nothing, and they're going to be happy. But that's our future we're looking at if we go on the current trajectory we're on now. But anyway, I'm getting tired here. It's almost midnight on my end. I'm going to upload this video. Have a great day, y'all. Stay safe out there. We'll probably see a day of ceasefire tomorrow. Less people will die, which is a good thing. But past that, I don't have high hopes, so we'll see. A continuation of war, a continuation of inflation, and things will only get harder from here on out. All right, good night, everyone. See you tomorrow.